Washington, good afternoon in Europe, good evening in Asia. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted, in coordination with my colleague Josh Lipsky, the head of the Geoeconomic Center, to present this event to you today, to talk about the frozen Russian reserves, especially the state reserves in the international financial system. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is now in its 10th year, and the large conventional invasion, which is now in its 2nd year, has been the greatest challenge to the global world order since the end of the Cold War. To deal with the challenge, we need to think more broadly beyond the normal rules and normal procedures established within that order to deal with this challenge. We need to do that both on the military side and on the sanctions and economic side. We have with us this morning to talk about this 3 people who are extraordinarily well positioned to discuss it. 2 are literally world-class senior financial and economic officials. Larry Summer, former Treasury Secretary, among many other things. Bob Zoellick, former president of the World Bank, and many other things. And to discuss also the legal challenges, we have a former senior official from the State Department, Phil Zelikow. So I'm going to turn this over to Susan Glasser, who is a reporter who knows very well what's going on in Russia and Eurasia and other areas, to talk about the challenge of the Russian invasion, what we need to do to protect American and, for that matter, global interests. And then our 3 panelists will describe in great detail what the stakes are and why we can take controversial steps, like not just freezing the Russian assets, which have happened, but actually transferring them to Ukraine, which has suffered at least $500 billion worth of damage to their economy, and maybe more. Thank you very much, and thank you for all of our panelists and speakers.
Well, I want to thank Ambassador Herbst. It's great for you to host us here today, and this is definitely one of those panels where I'm here as the moderator so I can hear what our panelists have to say, because I think this is an extremely timely conversation. We have been drowning in the sort of 1 year since the invasion content, and what I was struck by was the framing of this conversation, which is much more forward-looking, it seems to me, than many of the discussions that we've been having. I'm lucky we don't have to introduce these panelists, but I do want to start out before we sort of roll up our sleeves and talk about the mechanics of what we might do going forward. I think it's important to sort of get a level-setting conversation going here around, what have we learned and not learned in 1 year? Because I think it strikes me that a certain amount of humility is perhaps in order when it comes to the tools that are available to us. Certainly, we can all say that when it comes to the threat of sanctions from the United States, they perhaps don't work exactly in the way we intended, or certainly have not yet proven to be a deterrent. But I want to ask each of you the same question to get us going today. And Bob, maybe you can start us off here. What have you learned and what has surprised you or not in terms of the tools we have financially to affect Russia at this point?
Well, first, let me thank the Atlantic Council and you, Susan, and my colleagues and friends for taking this on, because I think it's very timely and go to the heart of your question. Everyone knows we're in a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, it's economics at least as much as important as military discussions. So it's fine to discuss F-16s and tanks and so on and so forth, but the heart of this matter is going to be economic sustainability and resilience. The Russians have figured this out because they're going after the infrastructure, they're going after the shelter, they're trying to sort of chase people out. And so, in essence, my focus has been that you have an estimated $300 billion of Russian reserves that are frozen. So I'm not talking about the private money which runs oligarchs and others, which is politically interesting, but frankly is a different issue. And here's where I think this is critical for policy now. Number one, Ukraine needs about $3 to $5 billion a month simply to keep going. This is not military supplies, okay? Secondly, in terms of the Russians, since they understand this is partly economic warfare, it would send a signal to them that they won't be able to kill Ukraine economically, and in fact, they're up against the economic strength of the West. Even better if you can use Russian assets in the process of doing that. Third, you have to be focused on Ukrainian recovery and long-term reconstruction. And the reason I distinguish those is you've had a lot of Ukrainians leave. You're going to have to get some of those people back, and that's going to require some things in terms of shelters, schools, basic medical supplies. The reconstruction is a longer-term effort, but again, this money could be relevant for that. Fourth, we'll see what happens in 2023 in terms of the military action. My own guess is that, we'll see how the offensives work, but you may very well end up being a stalemate, in which case these funds could be useful in terms of trying to reach a settlement, to help Ukraine perhaps accept a little bit less than it wanted, maybe to have Russia sort of come around in different ways. When you're in diplomacy, you look for ways for leverage, and this is big leverage. And then the fifth and last point is, this really is an opportunity for people who care about international law to develop it a step further. As Phil knows, after the first Gulf War, the Iraqis were required to give compensation, not only the Kuwaitis, to others. And there's been a series of international law developments we can talk about. And I think for aggressive destruction, the idea that you could transfer these reserves for compensation with a trust fund and various controls would be an important development for future diplomacy.
All right, so we're jumping right into the proposal here, but just quickly, Larry, I want to go to you, but Bob, sanctions, have they performed as you expected over the last year?
I think one always had to recognize, starting out with the oil, that for a long time Russia was going to be able to have access to resources, and so so frankly, I think the Russians have done a relatively good job of minimizing the short and medium-term effects. And so some of the estimates about how far the economy would drop and others were probably overstated. Having said that, I think we just don't know for sure how it starts to grind away the ball bearings of the economy when you start to lose semiconductors, chips, other types of inputs in the economy. So I think over time, this will wear down the Russian economy. They've lost a lot of good people that have left. And so the long term for Russia is not good at this, but I wouldn't expect the sanctions to solve the problem.
Larry, do you want to jump in on this? I promise we're going to get to the issue of the $300 billion, but I do think everyone would be very interested. Do you agree with Bob? Was it overstated our ability a year ago to use sanctions alone as a tool of, I think the term was shock and awe at the time?
In general, this panel's going to be in raging agreement. And so
that's not good for a panel.
I found myself broadly in agreement with almost everything that Bob said. My guess is that the sanctions appear so far to have done less damage to the Russian economy than I think their authors suggested when they were first put in place, and frankly, than I think I would have expected. And I think that is for three reasons. First, we all need to remember in thinking about all aspects of this, that not everyone in the world sees this in the way that we in the United States and most in Western Europe see it. And there's very substantial leakage in the sanctions regime coming from the fact that countries with more than half the world's population and more than a third of the world's GDP are prepared to keep trading with Russia. And that permits substantial evasion of what otherwise would have done damage. Second, I think that the Russian economy did have, by virtue of having already deglobalized a bit, somewhat more ability and resilience with respect to sanctions than I think many have expected. And I think there were some analytic errors as people thought about it at the very beginning. The suggestion was made that the sanctions would reduce the ruble to rubble. But of course, if you stop exporting to a country, then it's going to stop exporting its foreign exchange, and that's going to lead to appreciation of its value. And third, I think the point that Bob made is right. The macroeconomics of GDP are not the only measure of how much damage is being done to an economy. And as inventories of spare parts, for example, are drawn down, impacts increase. So it may be that an assessment of the sanctions 9 months from now will show a larger effect than many are saying today. But I think the core point is that whatever the strategy is going forward, some idea that Russia is going to be forced to stop this or forced to a negotiating table by the kind of economic sanctions that a portion of the world is going to be able to muster is, I think, naive. And while there are conversations to be had about strengthening the sanctions regime in various ways, I think the greater scope for policy involves thinking about reinforcing the Ukrainian economy rather than further damaging the Russian economy.
Yeah, this I think is a really important point. Have you reevaluated in any way your view of where sanctions fall in the toolkit going forward as a result of what we've seen in this first year, Phil?
Yes, I have. I think, look, back to your original question, what have we been surprised by after a year? I think we've all been pleasantly surprised by the way things went on the military side. We've all been inspiringly surprised by the resilience and heroism of the Ukrainian people who are undergoing an extreme ordeal. We at first were pleasantly surprised that the Russians were so shocked by the asset freeze and Europe's willingness to wean itself off Russian energy, showing that Putin had miscalculated on a couple of things. It's kind of like we won Act 1, and now the surprise is we have no idea what to do in Act 2, because Act 1 didn't end the story. And so come then to your question about the sanctions. We are caught as a country, as a government, in a peacetime sanctions paradigm, when in fact we're in a wartime paradigm. Mm-hmm. The peacetime sanctions paradigm is you do some bad thing, we slap sanctions on you, eventually you, in your surly, sullen way, decide to give in, and we negotiate an end to sanctions. And so the sanctions are this temporary thing that are designed to coerce, you being a good boy again. That is, shall we say, not a realistic paradigm for this case. So then we're in a wartime paradigm. We have not adapted out of the sanctions paradigm into a wartime paradigm. It's like, wait, we did all these remarkable things and they didn't kind of like give up. And instead they doubled down, and we're like in a real war, a war of attrition that's measured by economic staying power. And meanwhile, we're sitting on all these Russian assets that we froze, so shocking them. And we have no idea what to do with them in order to put them to any useful use. We're just kind of sitting on them, wondering what to do next.
Yeah, well, that's right. And that gets us to the forward-looking part of this conversation. You mentioned in our pre-game warm-up, if you will, before we came in here, that Europe seems to be leaning into the idea of seizing these Russian assets and using them, per Larry's point, to shore up the Ukrainian economy. Do you think this is a division, or it's just that the U.S. hasn't caught up with this and that's where we're all headed?
I think the U.S. hasn't caught up. To be very clear, I think the Biden administration and the U.S. generally has done a remarkable job in many ways on the political military side. Everybody's an armchair general now. I think Leopard tanks will do this and F-16s will do that. And people are learning about ATACMS who never heard of ATACMS, right? I get it. It's all the 5-year-old armchair generals are chasing the military soccer ball, what's going on in the battlefield. It's irresistible. The war is being decided in the economy, as Bob said at the start. That's where the war is being decided. The Russians know it. They are strategically targeting the economy. We have no answer. This is not a Leopard tank problem. So there is no reconstruction program for Ukraine. None. The massive economic support we're doing is the IV you put into the patient who's bleeding to death in the ER in order to stabilize them in the ER so they don't die on the table. All we're doing at billions per month is keeping the patient alive in the ER. This is not a sustainable policy for giving Ukrainians hope that they're going to emerge from this ideal. We haven't gotten that together yet. Now, here's where the Europeans are. Europeans who are close to that ordeal, hosting millions of refugees and doing a lot of other things Americans mostly don't see, with a lot of costs we mostly don't tally. The European Council, that's the whole leadership of the European Union, issued a communique on Thursday of last week, which was not reported in our press. The communique said, we need to reconstruct Ukraine, not wait for the war is over. We need to use the frozen Russian state assets to do it, and we need to do it striving to the maximum extent possible under EU and international law. That's all the leaders of Europe last Thursday. Joe Biden has never said that. And that's now the goal we need to set that then can enable a program of hope for Ukraine's economy and society that matches the hope they have earned for themselves on the battlefield.
So, Bob, do you see a practical obstacle, or is it a political obstacle for the Biden administration going forward to doing this? And how much of a break is it with past precedent if we were to sort of join hands with Europeans and go in this direction?
Well, the reason I find this possibility of transferring the official Russian assets goes back something to what Larry and Phil said. See, I see it as a strategic move, not just as economics, to sort of shape the landscape sort of going forward. Anytime you make a big strategic move in the government, as we all know, there's going to be a lot of people that, right, oh, this concern, so on and so forth. But so you have to address them. One is the politics. And the politics, in my view, and I've tried this out with a number of members of Congress, argue, why not get on this? Because can you imagine members of Congress agreeing to give the $300 billion back to the Russians? I mean, that doesn't strike me as very logical, or frankly, European politics as well. I just spoke with some French officials this morning. There's a second issue, which Phil is the expert on, which is the legalities of this. And that's why it's important to distinguish the legalities for official assets are different than the legalities for oligarchs and private assets, different set of rights. And we could talk a little bit about what the experience has been in International Law Commission rulings, International Court of Justice. There's a legal basis that, again, some precedents with Iraq, but that's been developing over some 20 years that I think lawyers, by their nature, are cautious on this. And so that's another point. Then there's a third obstacle, which is what will it do to the dollar? And Larry and I have both discussed this in brief. You may want to pursue it further, but I don't think people hold dollar reserves so that they can invade countries. They hold it for macroeconomic stability. China holds dollar reserves because it makes a lot of dollars in terms of the exports, and frankly, if it could get rid of them, it would. It tries to move a little bit into gold and other situations. So I think that's an overstated concern, but people in financial markets and the Treasury will be kind of, oh, no, we don't know, this is something new that has to be done. And then there's a historical argument that I think is actually misplaced related to reparations. And just to take that briefly, sort of the reminder, of course, goes back to the idea of after World War I, did the reparations imposed on Weimar Germany, overburden them? First off, realize the reparations were like an ongoing tax. There was a burden. We're talking about a shift of assets, number one. Number two, and this may be the most fundamental point, Ukraine looks a lot more like Weimar Germany to me than Russia does. It's a new democracy. It's fragile. It has a weak economy. It wants to integrate with Europe. Weimar Germany accepted defeat. Russia hasn't accepted defeat. So if you want to take the World War I analogy, you should actually argue to try to be of some support here to the Ukrainians. But I think the combination of those arguments, the way government works, many people on this with this session, or we know about it, you can always come up with a lot of obstacles. And as Phil said, it's easy to focus on the military. That's, and watch how over the course of the year. I think what's really critically important as we enter the second year, as we've all sort of said, is the economics are going to be determinant of this. And they also can be a device to push against the Russians.
So, Larry, do you agree with Phil that we don't really have a policy for Act Two? And walk us through what you think might happen to this proposal to seize the Russian assets and to transfer them to Ukraine. Is that politically viable in your view as something that the Biden administration might endorse sooner rather than later?
Let me make a few points if I could, Susan. First, this is a relatively rare case, actually very rare in my experience, where the expedient thing is actually the right strategic thing. If you ask yourself, which is the politically easier course, seizing our adversaries' assets that we have already frozen, or appropriating taxpayer dollars to support economic reconstruction in Ukraine, overwhelmingly the easier course is relying on the Russian assets. And I am surprised that there has not already been more political pressure as various emergency packages have been proposed for Ukraine to draw on those assets. So in sum, we always say we do the easy thing domestically, politically. In this case, it's very clear what that is. Second, there's a lesson, it seems to me, and it's kind of a broad brush lesson, but nonetheless an important lesson, from the comparison of World War I and World War II in one respect. Now, Phil and Bob are both distinguished historians, and I'm just quantitative economist. But I think it's a fair statement that during World War I, everybody was preoccupied with the trench warfare, and nobody was much thinking about the post-war world and the economic reconstruction until after Armistice Day. In contrast, quite remarkably, Roosevelt and Churchill were heavily focused on that set of issues with the involvement of John Maynard Keynes as early as 1942 or even before that. So the end of a war was managed right. The winning of the peace was a focus even during the course of the war. The third thing I would say is, look, we are and are proud to be a nation of law rather than a nation just of immediate expediency. And so it is right that there be proper legal forms, that multilateral approaches be taken wherever possible. By the way, some substantial fraction of the Russian assets are held in euros. So I think it's appropriate that there be some deliberation. And I think that it is easy when one feels urgency about things not to appreciate the importance of the checks and balances that characterize the American system. That said, I think we will get there. I think it's important, and this was a point that Bob made, that we get there during the period of the conflict, and that the use of these reserves be part of a strategy of supporting Ukraine during the conflict. I think it's more difficult to imagine those reserves being called on for the first time in the aftermath of some kind of Ukrainian victory here. As strong as the morality and the moral claims in this war are, I don't think that peace based on vengeance has historically been an effective strategy. On the other hand, fighting and carrying out conflicts in the most effective ways, it seems to me, is natural and right. So I hope that in the next several months, as we move to the international financial meetings in April, as we move to the G7 meetings this summer, that this is an agenda that will move forward on an accelerated pace. And I think that is possible. I do not find plausible the idea that, given all the various things that have happened already, and by the way, these assets are frozen. It is not that these are assets that Russia can make any use of right now. And so putting those assets to productive use is somehow going to destroy the role of the dollar. And if countries that are planning to launch wars of naked aggression decide not to give U.S. seigniorage by holding U.S. treasuries, I think that will certainly be an all right thing.
So
I would just add, if I could, just one last point. We have focused on the use of these assets to support Ukraine. And I don't think there's any question but that should be the primary use of these resources. But there are countries in the global south that have been impoverished, in which people are hungry because of the Ukraine war and because of what Russia has done. There are countries bearing very substantial burdens associated with refugees as a consequence of this war. So as we contemplate a strategy, my instinct would be that the largest part of it, the preponderance, should be used for Ukrainian support, but that there should be allocations made both for refugees and for victims through high food and energy prices of this conflict. And I think in addition to being right morally, that is also attractive as a strategy of building global support here.
Mm-hmm. So before, Phil, we jump into the question of how we should spend it, what, aside from World War I, in your view, are there specific precedents for legally being able to proceed doing this? That's come up a few times already in the course of this conversation. It's a discussion people are going to want to have. Bob has made the point that there is a difference between Russian state assets and those assets that have been seized of non-state actors, Russian oligarchs and the like. So
right.
just quickly, do you believe there is a legal basis for proceeding? And if so, what is the mechanism by doing so? Is this going to have to be an ad hoc arrangement that the European governments and the United States come up with? Or how would we go about making these determinations?
The legal way to do it is straightforward, and there are good precedents. The way you do it is you transfer the Russian state assets that you have frozen, which are frozen in your country's accounts. These aren't sitting in Moscow. So these are sitting in New York and London and Paris and Zurich. You transfer those to an escrow fund for Ukraine reconstruction. So for instance, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, world condemned, the United States and other countries then promptly moved to freeze and seize Iraqi assets. Those were all then to be put to use to rebuild Kuwait and help other damaged countries. The Iraqi assets were simply then transferred to escrow funds that ultimately became a claims commission, which dispersed $52 billion to people who were damaged by Iraq's war of aggression. That was a straight-up seizure of Iraqi state assets done under American domestic law, under the old IEPA law. And there's ample international law for this. International lawyers have no debate about is Ukraine entitled to compensation for an internationally wrongful act? Yes. Do we have a suitable adjudication of the internationally wrongful act? Yes. Don't need new tribunals, don't need any new courts, already have the UN resolutions, already have an International Court of Justice ruling. So that's all you need. You don't need a special court ruling. You don't need to go to court at all. This is state-on-state action. This is no litigation involved. And the state orders the transfer of the frozen funds that are already being held by a bank in its jurisdiction in New York to another bank in New York, which then is, the Ukraine Reconstruction Trust Fund has already been created by the European Union. So what you have then, the only disagreement really among the international lawyers has to do with the sanctions paradigm versus another kind of paradigm. The sanctions paradigm is, it's clear I can seize your money, that I can breach international obligations because you've broken your obligations. The usual international law is, I do this to make you pay. I do this to make you pay the debt you owe. So the sanctions paradigm is, I do this to coerce you to eventually do the deal in which you agree to pay for the compensation. The wartime theory, though, there is an alternative theory, which is a wartime theory. And the wartime theory is also, it's the same thing. I'm going to do this to make you pay, but here's it. I'm going to take your money until you pay your debt. I have your money, and I'm going to take it and use it to pay the debt unless you step up to pay the debt. By the way, this is, of course, the theory that every bank that's ever given a loan understands. So this is not like some strange concept. When banks hold collateral, they hold collateral as coercion to make you pay your debt, or else they're going to pay your debt some other way. So in effect, what we have here is, instead of thinking the sanctions paradigm where Russia eventually surrenders and signs the deal, during the war while it's going on, we start taking the Russian money, put it to work to pay the debt because they're not willing to step up and pay it. But the moment they wave their hand and say, okay, we're ready to participate in this, we want to have some say about this, great, sit down at the table, we negotiate a resolution in which you participate. But if you don't participate, we're going to use your money to pay these debts.
Mm-hmm. Could I just one little point on this? So Phil has emphasized the international. As he suggested, there's an argument that under the current IEPA, which is International Emergency Act, that you could do this. But going back to something that Larry said, I think Phil and I agree, I think it'd be great for Congress to make sure there's also a domestic authorization. And two of the leading members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Risch and Whitehouse, have already been drafting a bill to this effect. Mm-hmm. But it goes back to some of the politics and the caution. The bill hasn't moved, in part because of the other hesitations, or maybe also preoccupations on other issues. So I think you need to combine the international with the domestic. You do it in a way that's a due deliberation. But not only would it be good policy, but I think it'd be good legal development.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of questions, as you might imagine, Phil, all in your, like, how can we do it? What are the mechanisms? But before we get to the audience, Larry, you said something very provocative, which is the idea that it matters politically as well as in a policy sense to be thinking about rebuilding Ukraine while the war is going on. And that obviously sends a powerful message. How practical do you think that is? And how would you envision and recommend doing so, given that Russia has clearly undertaken a quite purposeful strategy of attacking Ukrainian infrastructure, attacking the foundations of its economy, and is likely to continue doing so? Can we rebuild when they're just going to rebomb?
Perhaps I was not clear. What the Atlantic Charter happened towards the beginning of World War II. The Marshall Plan happened several years after World War II, as did the actual formation of the international institutions. I think it's naive to think that you can rebuild the Ukrainian infrastructure in the middle of the war. I don't think it's naive to believe that you can provide a continuous flow of resources on which the Ukrainian budget can rely during the war. I've been through a lot of these things. The lags are very, very long. Now is the time to begin a process of detailed planning for Ukrainian reconstruction. But I agree with you that putting in place large-scale capital goods is probably not feasible in this context. I think it's also important here to record one sober note that I think is very important for everyone to be aware of as they think about this set of issues. To be blunt, Ukrainian economic performance from 1989 to 2014 was dismal, even by the standards of the countries that had been liberated by the end of the Cold War, with corruption not being a small part of the problem. And so I think that we all agree on the absolute centrality, by the way, for avoiding a third Russian invasion of Ukraine, of Ukraine's economic success. We all agree, I think, on the centrality of Europe, of Ukraine coming together with Europe so as to be maximally strong in association with and ultimately as a member of the European Union. But I think it is very important that we not suppose that the Ukrainian economic issue is only or is even primarily just a matter of mobilizing resources. There's a lot else that needs to be recognized here.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
To go to your question about the preparation, there's been some very good work done by the Center for European Policy Reform, which is sort of a transatlantic group of luminaries kind of looking at this issue. The World Bank and others of EBRD have started to look at these issues. But I think it's important for this purposes to divide this into three different parts. One, as Larry and I have said, there's survival. There's the $3 to $5 billion a month separate from the military, just so you can pay salaries and make sure that you don't have an inflationary spiral and so on and so forth. Second, there's an important phrase of what I refer to as a recovery, which is not rebuilding all the infrastructure they're going to destroy, but what are the things, there are parts of Western Ukraine that are safer to make it easier for people to come back, and schools and basic sort of shelter situation, so as to give the resilience of Ukraine and its people. And then the third is the longer term sort of reconstruction. On the longer term part, but this again goes to sort of Larry's sort of strategic outlook here, I think it's also important that the G7 and the G20 and other supporters start to think about how would they structure that to deal with some of the problems of corruption and oligarchs and others. And one possibility, what the Marshall Plan did was it set up an agency, ECHA, that actually went out of business, okay? And one of the few times this happens in governmental side. And I think people are going to have to think about this because Europe obviously is got the primary interest, and as Larry said, the strategic goal is to bring them into the European Union. That's just like bringing Weimar into the international economy. That's got to be the guiding star. But I think people will be uncomfortable if it's just sort of a sub-piece of the European Commission. It'll be bureaucratically bogged down. So one possibility would be to create something that has a key European dimension. The World Bank, Larry did this, the chief economist, I was there as president, would often coordinate these activities. They were called consultative groups, so that you sort of made sure that people weren't stepping all over each other. There are different ways you could structure this, but I think the important part, again, the way you started it is, okay, we need the military action, we need the equipment, but it's time to be thinking about the resources and structure of short-term recovery, reconstruction. And by the way, that also sends a message to Putin. It sends a message to Putin that he's dealing with the G7 economies, for God's sakes. I mean, does he really think he's going to overcome them on the economic issues?
I'm glad you brought Putin back up. We're about to get to questions from the audience, and we're very grateful we have an in-person audience, as well as lots of questions coming in on Zoom. So I want to make sure that we reward these folks for actually showing up in person. Thank you for that. Get ready. But bringing it back to Putin, because I do think that's important. I know this panel has characterized itself as in violent agreement with each other, but I am curious whether we think we've got the 300 billion in seized assets. Are there no other tools at this point? Are we really talking in our focus on Ukraine? Are there any other ways in which you can envision a next phase, a next act of the war that does something more than offer the patient bleeding on the table what funds we've already managed to accrue? Phil, is there anything else that you can envision that belongs as part of this conversation going forward in terms of Russia?
Yeah, if you look at the Russian calculus here, everyone is hoping that Russia will decide at some point to talk about an end to the war. Right now, the Russians don't think they're done on the battlefield, and they think they're winning the war in Ukraine's economy. They're targeting Ukraine's economy and wrecking it. Their economy is substantially invulnerable from counterattack. They're conducting, these missile strikes are being very systematically targeted. So then the answer to that is, by let's say the second half of this year, Russia should see a situation in which militarily on the battlefield they're not getting anywhere, and they're not, and their goal of wrecking the Ukrainian economy and society is not going to succeed. That instead Ukraine is now being offered hope, just the way Bob was pointing out. Look, the G7 have gotten their act together. There's now a major effort that's going to build Ukraine back better, so that actually the Russians look at this as that we're not moving on the battlefield, and our goal of wrecking their economy and society is not going to succeed in the short term or long term. And then they have to recalculate where they're going with this war and how it can proceed. And even if the war then ends at that point with some kind of armistice or frozen conflict, Ukraine is basically then on the road to the future nation it needs to become. And Putin sees that, and he is forced to recalculate.
I'll add one other element that's a little going to be controversial, but so the Chinese issued a statement, okay, and there's a lot of blather in there, and you can sort of, but as you know, in diplomacy, you can maybe pick up the things that you like and sort of ignore the things you don't like. So I would be pushing the Chinese also to recognize that they're out of line on this with Moscow. They're not going to abandon Putin, but what about if they're willing to support Ukraine a little bit, starting out with humanitarian, maybe be involved in the reconstruction? You get a lot of people screaming, oh, no, we don't want China in there. If you really want to sustain Ukraine and put China in a position where someday it may push Putin a little bit, why not have them be involved in the process? It goes to Larry's point is, in the midst of war, it's easy to kind of sort of take the moral judgment and say, look, we have to keep them out of it. If you want to look towards a long-term victory, you want to get everybody to accept the idea of a Ukrainian democracy linked to Europe, successful economy.
So I want to bring in our colleague.
Susan, I think Susan?
Yeah.
I think you're hearing from, you're certainly hearing from me, and I think you're hearing from my fellow panelists here, something very important, which is the greater scope for effective policy from here is overwhelmingly on the side of using economics to help Ukraine rather than using economics to punish Russia. And not because we wouldn't like to, but because there are limits on the available tools and limits on the available leverage given where all the countries in the world are. And I think that's just a very important lesson for policy going forward. And I think the mobilization of those $300 billion is probably the most effective leverage on Russia's strategy that remains available from this point.
And to broaden the coalition, as Larry mentioned. I mean, in the U.S. and Europe, you often ignore all the abstainers, okay? But I think you could probably broaden your coalition if some of that money helped some of the developing countries that have been squeezed.
Well, that's a good setting up our first question, which we're going to have today from Charles Litchfield, who is the Deputy Director of our co-sponsor of the event, the Geoeconomics Center here.
Thanks, Susan. And indeed, at the Geoeconomics Center, we're very grateful to the Eurasia Center for allowing us to co-host. I have a very brief question, which stems from some research the Geoeconomics Center did towards the end of last year. And that's to do with the size of this number, the 300 billion. The panelists probably know that that is derived from a Russian data set, which the central bank used to update regularly. It no longer does. But up until late 2021, early 2022, they were claiming that about 300 billion of their reserves were stored in the West. Not just with Western central banks, but some of it in private banks. Since then, since the war, task force have been launched in the US, in the EU, elsewhere, to find these assets. So far, they've only come up with about 100 billion. They may be making progress on that, but I think that's about where they are right now. I was wondering if the panelists had any idea why this discrepancy exists. It strikes me that it's quite important to forewarn the Ukrainians about just how much we might be able to give them, whether it's 100 or 300 billion. Thank you.
So 3 points. One, you know, I've been out of government for a while, but 100 billion is still not a bad place to start. Second, as we've said, Ukrainians can't use all that money anyway. It's going to take time. But third, going back to some of the legal work that Phil has done, you know, if the U.S. or Europe pass implementing legislation, they should demand reports from financial institutions about what's held and where. And so that's where you kind of combine the sanctions legal regime with this asset regime. So, you know, maybe worst comes to worst, you only get 200 billion. Well, you know, it's good enough for government work.
Larry, do you have any thoughts about how much it actually is at this point?
I don't have a thought there, but I would underscore very strongly something Bob said, which is there are limits on absorption capacity. Ukraine's GDP is about $180 billion. That means that $300 billion would be 170% of Ukrainian GDP. The Marshall Plan was less than 10% of Western Europe's GDP. I think in general, experience suggests that there are limits to how much money can be moved, how quickly. So I don't think there's much risk that we're going to move too much money. And I think the real priority is finding ways to, right now, institutionalize the money and the flow of ongoing support, start getting very direct on what Bob called the recovery money, compensate the third countries outside of Russia and Ukraine, and begin making plans on the infrastructure.
All right, we have
Just to also keep in mind that there'll be private money will follow the public money. This is also the Marshall Plan pattern and pattern in a number of other cases, also the reconstruction of East Germany after unification, is you prime the pump with a lot of private investments, and the private investments both ensure the public investments. And the public investments both kind of ensure and anchor and pave the way for then a lot of people to see lucrative private investments. And ultimately, the economic impact comes from the flow of both.
Well, we have a lot of questions. Many of them are about the mechanics of doing this, Phil. And so I think we'll go to you once again. A lot of questions about, for example, whether there is a resolution that is required in order to proceed from the international courts,
Right.
whether using Russian assets for reconstruction how you would do that. What are the actual mechanisms? We can go on from there, but maybe just give us a little bit more sense of like, okay, let's just say that Joe Biden agrees with the European Council tomorrow. When is the money going to flow?
They could start transferring money next week. There's a wide, when people raise these issues, they're often, oh, well, there are legal problems. And then it's kind of like it shuts down conversation. Lawyers are wringing their hands, and then politicians throw up their hands. You do not need any new adjudications. You do not need a tribunal or a court ruling. There are a number of precedents one can cite on this.
But to emphasize, you've had 2 UN General Assembly votes, and you've had an International Court of Justice. So
Right.
Correct.
this.
You've already got. If you need the adjudication that Russia has committed the internationally wrongful act of aggression, for which it now is liable for compensation under international law, that's done. You got that from the ICJ last year, and you've got the multiple UN resolutions now, including one explicitly calling for Russia to compensate for damages of its aggression. That was passed by the UN, I think, in November.
All right. So, Bob, here's...
I want to add something on this that I think is very important. Look, there are always legal questions and there are always legal challenges to things that governments do. This idea rests on a vastly more secure legal foundation than student loan debt relief of the kind that is being heard by the Supreme Court. One's never certain how these things will play out, but the weight of legal opinion here is vastly stronger in its favor than on many things that have been done domestically because they were felt to be very important by administrations of both parties. And here we are talking about something where there's a broad motivation to act, not doing something where an administration is relying on executive authority because they can't get authority from Congress.
And just one little point here, as many years since I clerked on the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit that dealt with these questions, but you'll hear many people say, litigation. Where exactly in the Constitution does Russia have a legal right to due process? I kind of missed that one in law school.
All right, well, we're almost out of time, but actually this is another one I want to throw to you, Bob, from James Berman. Does $300 billion matter enough to Russia economically to be an effective and sustainable strategic lever? And what other sources of money could be integrated into the arsenal to add even more heft?
So it's an important question, and I think the way none of us know for sure what will lead Putin to accept a settlement, if he will. Okay? Yeah. We just don't know. But what the thrust of this conversation has been is we need to strengthen the Ukrainian side. Okay, so it will matter to Ukraine, obviously, first to survive, then to recover, then reconstruct. And if at the end of the day, Putin still wants to have a frozen conflict, if you've got a Ukraine that can withstand it, be successful in terms of holding its military position and moves towards the EU, that's a strategic victory. Okay, so I do, again, one of the benefits of the funds would be, maybe if Russia decides it can get some of the money back, that's where you have this negotiation and stuff. So I'm not suggesting that this will convince Russia to act. Gives you leverage, gives you pressure, and it certainly strengthens the Ukrainian side.
All right, Phil, you get a final word here on, are we looking primarily at, it seems like your argument is not practical but in the end, political calculations about whether and how to proceed with this. So do you think it's going to happen, and on what time frame?
I really think that this turns now on politics, not practicality. The practicality is there. Larry's point was very important on this. If President Biden basically told his government, this is where this needs to go, find the way, it's doable.
And the British and the Canadians are probably there. They're looking
And
for the U.S.
So is the Swedish presidency of the European Council that just led. So is Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, it's just, the politicians are there in a way. They just kind of, need the lawyers to show them how to do it. There are several of us lawyers who have already written out the blueprint, and we'd be happy to sit down. But look, a lot of lawyers are reacting neuralgically to this because they haven't done anything quite like this before in their working lives. They weren't around, as Bob and I were, for the Iraq invasion of Kuwait.
I thought you were going to say World War I, but that's not right.
Alexander Hamilton and I really worked on a lot of this.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting case where actually people are a bit buffaloed by the fact that there are legal complexities. But the politicians are coming around to this, and interestingly, the Biden administration is still trying to catch up because it's divided internally on this question.
What is the divide as you see it?
Let's just say that financial people are instinctively neuralgic about people messing with central bank assets. And this is an issue, though, where I think the time is ripe for the president to lead his government.
So, Larry, if you were at the Treasury Department right now, what is the recommendation that you would make to President Biden?
I would feel that it was imperative to find a way to do this, that there needed to be a very careful way of cocooning any possible precedent. And I would be pounding my legal staff and my enforcement staff to find the best ways of cocooning the precedent. But I would feel that the precedent value and the risks of not standing up for international order here, international order with respect to penalizing aggressors, with respect to supporting victims of aggression, with respect to maintaining international community after an act that had pervasive toxic consequences. I would feel that setting that precedent dwarfed any risk to the standing of the dollar in the current environment. And I would regard this as very important multilateralism. I would also be, and this is the last thing I'll say, I would also be introducing one other element into the calculus that hasn't really been discussed here. The world's a very dangerous place. Climate, pandemics, insecure areas in a variety of ways. Ukraine is a very urgent problem. There is a risk that if this kind of means of financing is not mobilized, that the support for Ukraine, as important as it is, will cannibalize global efforts on other areas of development and other areas of planetary security. And it seems to me that Treasury, as the steward of the United States relationship with the international financial institutions, has an enormous stake in there being budget space to provide for those institutions to address issues of poverty, issues of climate, issues of pandemic. So I would believe that the right thing to do here was to find a way.
All right. Well, I think we'll have to leave it there. We'll see if President Biden is listening to your arguments. I'm not sure how much he'd like your student loan debt argument, but maybe the climate change one would be better. And I've also learned a new phrase, cocooning the precedent. But seriously, thank you so much for joining us remotely, all of those of you who've been listening, and to everyone who's come in person, Larry, Bob, Phil, this has really been a fantastic and I think really helpful and concrete conversation. So thank you, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for convening us today.
Thank you, Susan.